The man known to history as Sir Hugh Dowding, later 1st Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory, was born in the village of Moffat, around 50 miles south of Edinburgh, on the 24th of April 1882. Although born in Scotland, both of Dowding's parents originally hailed from southern England. Hugh's father, Arthur Dowding, came from a family of clergymen in Wiltshire. After attending Winchester College, one of England's most prestigious public schools, he studied at New College, Oxford, before becoming a teacher. Arthur was teaching at Fettes College in Edinburgh, one of Scotland's most illustrious schools, when he set up St Ninian's Boys' Preparatory School in Moffat in 1879. In 1880, Arthur married Maud Tremenhere, the daughter of Lieutenant General Charles Tremenhere, who served as a military engineer in India. Hugh was to be the eldest of 4 children born to Arthur and Maud between 1882 and 1889. After Hugh, there was a daughter named Hilda, followed by 2 more boys named Arthur and Kenneth. Unlike other boys of his social background, the young Hugh Dowding was not sent to boarding school, and was instead taught by his father at St Ninian's. Hugh later recalled that from a young age, he developed a habit of challenging received wisdom, which would make him an unruly subordinate during his military career. In 1896, at the age of 14, Hugh left St Ninian's and went to Winchester College, where he remained for the next 4 years. Unlike his father, who became a prefect, Hugh did not distinguish himself at Winchester. His academic performance was subpar, and he also did not excel at sports. He particularly struggled with Greek and Latin, 2 standard subjects of the Victorian-era curriculum. As a result, he could not follow in his father's footsteps by going to the University of Oxford. Instead, he decided to embark on a military career and enrolled at the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich in September 1899. While he hoped to become a military engineer like his maternal grandfather, due to poor examination results, Dowding was instead commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the Royal Garrison Artillery in August 1900. The young artilleryman was first deployed to the Rock of Gibraltar, a major British naval base at the time, guarding the mouth to the Mediterranean. In late 1901, he was transferred to Colombo, Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, where he began to play polo, a sport that would become one of his favourite social pastimes. Several months later, Dowding's company moved to Hong Kong, where he was promoted to lieutenant in May 1902. Dowding later recalled his time in Hong Kong fondly, as there were plenty of opportunities for polo, horse racing and yachting. He was still there when Japan launched an attack on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur in Manchuria in February 1904, marking the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War. As the Japanese laid siege to Port Arthur, trapping the Russian Pacific Fleet inside the harbour, the Russians dispatched their Baltic fleet around the world to relieve the Pacific Fleet. During the course of these events, the British at Hong Kong were on high alert, as the British had 2 years earlier agreed an alliance with the Japanese. Though they did not intervene before the Russian Baltic Fleet, having sailed around Africa to the Far East, was annihilated by the Japanese at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, bringing the war to an end. In April 1904, the 22-year-old Dowding was transferred to a mountain battery near Rawalpindi in the Punjab in the north of the British Raj. He would spend the next 6 years of his life in this mountainous corner of northern India. There were plenty of opportunities for polo and shooting, and despite the rainy conditions, he enjoyed being in the remote mountains. By 1910, the 28-year-old Dowding sought permission to attend the British Army's Staff College at Camberley in Surrey. His commanding officers refused, and instead he was transferred to an Indian battery at Dehradun in the foothills of the Himalayas. Dowding later claimed that this was the most enjoyable posting of his military career. Nevertheless, in 1911, when he was granted his wish of returning to England, he left and was soon admitted to Camberley a few months short of his 30th birthday in January 1912. While at Camberley, Dowding believed that his instructors were sticking too rigidly to old doctrines. As far as Lieutenant Dowding was concerned, his teachers at Camberley continued to put an unreasonable amount of faith in the efficacy of cavalry divisions, despite their glaring vulnerability to modern machine gun and artillery fire. They also failed to appreciate the potential military applications of the newly emergent airplanes for both reconnaissance and offensive warfare. During his time at the Staff College, Dowding's reserved manner earned him the nickname Stuffy from his peers. Though this was also the time he made his first visit to Switzerland with his family and acquired a lifelong passion for skiing, later serving as president of the Ski Club of Great Britain in 1924 and 1925. In August 1913, following exactly 13 years of military service, Dowding was promoted to captain. In order to acquire a better understanding of the military potential of airplanes, Dowding learned to fly privately and received his pilot certificate on the 20th of December 1913, the same day as his graduation from Camberley. While he intended to remain in the army, in early 1914 he attended a flying course in Upavon in Salisbury, organised by the Royal Flying Corps, the British Army's air arm founded in 1912. Over the course of 3 months, Dowding learned to fly increasingly sophisticated machines, including the BE-2C biplane. A brief period followed for Dowding with a regiment in the Isle of Wight. However, war was soon brewing on the continent as a political crisis in the Balkans in June and July 1914 snowballed into a European-wide war in the last days of July and the first days of August 1914. After years of growing tensions amongst the great powers over everything from colonial rivalry to border disputes, the First World War, which now began, pitted Britain, France and Russia against Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, with numerous smaller powers involved as well. With the commencement of the conflict in August 1914, Dowding reported as a qualified pilot to the RFC. His first task was to help organise 4 squadrons to support the British Expeditionary Force sent across the English Channel to fight the German invasion of Belgium and France. In early October 1914, he joined 6th Squadron as an observer and spent time in the air over Belgium and northern France, reporting what he was seeing on the ground. At this early juncture in the war, all sides were simply using airplanes for reconnaissance missions. But this situation would soon change as pilots began affixing guns to their planes. Before long, bombs were also being dropped from ever larger and more sophisticated models. On the 29th of November, Dowding's squadron was organised into 2nd Wing, based in Saint-Omer in Normandy. Not long after, Dowding became a fighter pilot, and in early 1915 he was appointed as a flight commander in Major Hubert Musgrave's 9th Squadron, which was tasked with communicating with artillery batteries by wireless telegraphy to provide real-time data on the accuracy of their firing. After Musgrave returned to the army, Dowding replaced him as commander. Dowding's 9th Squadron consisted of a talented group of 14 pioneering officers, of which 4, including Dowding himself, would rise to the rank of Air Marshal. However, by March 1915, the original squadron was broken up, and the newly promoted Major Dowding took command of a reformed 9 Squadron based at Brooklands Airfield in Surrey, where he joined experiments to improve wireless communication systems. Although Dowding had no pilots with him and was obliged to train 2 newly commissioned officers to fly, he was fortunate to be supported by Charles Edmund Prince, a former employee of the Marconi Company, a pioneer of telecommunications. In order to avoid the delays associated with army procurement procedures, Dowding and Prince went to Marconi's offices, where the former distracted the storekeeper with tales of dogfights while the latter stole what was needed for their experiments. Using a higher quality valve, Prince built a radio set 4 times lighter than the official set with 4 times the range. However, even after tests demonstrated that Prince's creation was more effective, the War Office refused to adopt the new model. In July 1915, after 4 frustrating months running up against military bureaucracy, Dowding was ordered back to France to take command of 16 Squadron. By the summer of 1915, the RFC came to the realization that its planes were being outmatched by the German aircraft, in particular the Fokker E-3 monoplane, which could fire through its propeller. Military aviation was still in its infancy, and during the Battle of Loos in September 1915, Dowding found himself in the air with one of his pilots when ice began to form on the wings and the instruments began to malfunction. After losing course and running out of fuel, Dowding was fortunate to land behind British lines. During Dowding's 6 months in command, 16 Squadron only brought down a single plane, and Dowding's leadership divided opinion among his subordinates. He was not a very good pilot himself and was rarely in the air. His reserved demeanor kept him at a distance from his juniors, but he also improved living conditions for his pilots, refused to blame them for crashes, and recognized that they were burdened with responsibilities beyond what they were trained for. In January 1916, Dowding returned to England and was promoted to lieutenant colonel, while taking command of 7 Wing based in Gosport in Hampshire. For 6 months, he was responsible for organizing defenses against night raids from German Zeppelins, airships which were widely used for bombing missions during the First World War. Dowding found himself during this time with limited resources and only vague instructions from the War Office. He returned to France in June as commander of 9 Wing, which supported the Somme offensive that began on the 1st of July 1916, one of the largest engagements of the entire war. The Royal Flying Corps lost 545 men over the 6 months of the Battle of the Somme. Dowding's performance and leadership during this was perhaps open to criticism, but the one thing that he was trying to do was innovate in terms of aerial tactics, something which was very necessary in an age when aerial warfare was still evolving. Dowding was sent back to England in January 1918 to take command of the Southern Training Brigade from his headquarters at Salisbury in Wiltshire. Although he was promoted to colonel and to brigadier general in June, he saw no further frontline action during the First World War. When the RFC and the Royal Naval Air Service merged to become the Royal Air Force, or RAF, in April 1918, Dowding was sent to York to serve in an administrative role. He was there when news of the armistice and the German surrender arrived in November 1918. The German economy having effectively collapsed under the weight of war with Britain, France, and from April 1917, the United States. With the end of the war, the Air Force was significantly reduced. Even as demobilization was taking place, Dowding was appointed as a group captain on the 1st of August 1919, on the advice of Dowding's commanding officer, Sir V.L. Vivian. His personal life was also changing. In February 1918, Dowding married Clarice Maud Vancourt, whose cousin, Major John Beck, had been Dowding's commanding officer while he served in 6th Squadron back in 1914. The widow of a British Army officer who was killed in an accident before the war, Clarice already had a daughter from her first marriage. In January 1919, a son named Derek was born to them. He would become a fighter pilot in the Second World War. Dowding was devastated when Clarice died suddenly on the 28th of June 1920, just over 2 years after their marriage. He would not marry again until much later in his life. The loss of his wife and the responsibility of holding air pageants at RAF Hendon in North London led Dowding to a state of physical and mental exhaustion in the early 1920s. The air shows attracted tens of thousands of spectators, including royalty and social and political elites, and served as the RAF's best advertisement against its abolition, which was advocated by influential Army and Navy officers as well as government officials, who claimed that the maintenance of it was too costly now that the war was over. For his work organizing mock aerial combat and bombing raids, Dowding was promoted to Air Commodore in January 1922. In September 1924, he was posted overseas as Chief Staff Officer at the headquarters of the RAF's Iraq Command in Baghdad. Britain had taken control of Iraq as a mandate on behalf of the League of Nations following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. air power was considered a cost-effective way to keep control of the region compared to maintaining large numbers of soldiers on the ground, especially in the thinly populated desert regions of Mesopotamia. Dowding was soon recommended for appointment as Director of Training at the Air Ministry from May 1926, where his brother Arthur served as the Royal Navy's liaison officer. Here, Dowding overcame local opposition and helped to set up 4 bombing ranges. For his efforts, he was promoted to the rank of Air Vice Marshal in 1929. In September, Dowding received orders to take overall command of the British military presence in Palestine and Transjordan, where hostilities between Arabs and Jews reached an intensity in another British mandate that forced the British government to strengthen its forces in the region in the interwar period. After inspecting the region by air and on the ground, Dowding concluded that the British should do more to ensure Jewish security, but that the British should not impose a Jewish state in Palestine without also following up on promises of self-government to the Arabs made in 1916. By the time Dowding returned to England in December, the situation in Palestine was relatively calm, but this was not to last. After returning to Britain, Dowding would spend the next decade of his life working on Britain's air defence. During the First World War, Britain had come under attack from German Zeppelin airships and Gotha bombers, resulting in hundreds of casualties. Although these figures would be dwarfed by German bombing raids a generation later during the Second World War, the inability to prevent enemy aircraft arriving unannounced to destroy critical infrastructure and kill innocent civilians led to political unrest. In his capacity as First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill had political responsibility for air defence and recognised the need for an integrated air defence system incorporating anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, balloons, aircraft and coastal observers, while the RFC established a separate Home Defence Wing in 1916. However, it was only when Major General Edward Ashmore of the RFC assumed single command of air defence that Britain's armed forces developed a coordinated approach. Under Hugh Trenchard, the RFC and later RAF adopted the doctrine that a good air defence was dependent on offensive capabilities, and that bombing raids against the enemy not only served as a deterrent but also increased morale at home. After the end of the First World War, much of Ashmore's air defence system was disbanded, yet the British government, alert to the possibility of a future war, established Air Defence Great Britain in 1925, with 35 bomber squadrons and 17 fighter squadrons. The same year, the Home Office created an Observer Corps, consisting mostly of unpaid volunteers manning a network of observation posts in southeastern England, equipped with telephones. This came under RAF control in 1929, right around the time that Dowding arrived back to England from the Middle East. He assumed control of Air Defence's fighter planes upon his return. He later recalled the farcical training exercises, during which he challenged the RAF's preference for bomber planes by setting up an advanced warning system to allow his fighters to get into the air to meet the opposing bombers. He then ordered one of his fighters to follow the bombers back to their base and send a signal to his colleagues to annihilate them on the ground while they were refueling, demonstrating that bomber planes without a sufficiently strong fighter wing would quickly be destroyed in any live war. In August 1930, Dowding was promoted to the Air Council of the Air Ministry, the RAF's governing body, as the officer with special responsibility for supply and research. Not long into his stint, he approved the airworthiness of the R-101, a new airship which exploded after crashing in France on its maiden voyage in early October, killing 48 of the 54 people on board, including Lord Thompson of Cardington, Secretary of State for Air in the British government. Dowding had little experience of airships and later admitted that although he had been on board a 16-hour trial flight, he had been too willing to accept overly optimistic technical reports of their safety without further trials. An inquiry into the crash avoided blaming anyone explicitly, enabling Dowding to keep his job. But after the tragedy, Dowding would insist henceforth on conducting his own tests of new equipment rather than accepting expert opinion. During the 1930s, the British political and military elites were desperate to prevent the outbreak of further hostilities after the horrors of the First World War. This extended to prohibitions on some forms of aerial warfare. For instance, the British government unsuccessfully sought an international agreement to ban aerial bombardment through the League of Nations. Yet by the second half of the decade, this was proving impossible. Although Germany had been prevented by the Treaty of Versailles from having an air force, its fascist leader from early 1933, Adolf Hitler, disregarded the prohibition, and a new German Luftwaffe was being developed from 1935 onwards by Hermann Göring, one of the most senior Nazi ministers. Britain and France initially chose to turn a blind eye to this, in the hope that the Luftwaffe would remain a small air force. However, as the years went by and as Germany began annexing parts of Central Europe, such as Austria and the Sudetenland, in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, there were growing calls to expand the Royal Air Force from the likes of Winston Churchill, who warned that German bombing raids could kill tens of thousands of civilians in a single week. Although Churchill's warnings had initially been dismissed as alarmist, the RAF recognized that the failure of air defense could lead to German invasion and occupation. And for the next few years, the RAF was focused on maintaining or regaining parity with German aircraft numbers, albeit while retaining emphasis on bombers over fighters. At the same time, British air defences, which had previously turned towards France, were now directed east towards Germany. Dowding, who had been promoted to full Air Marshal in January 1933 and received a knighthood in June, recognised that Britain's air defences were no match for the German threat, and British fighters did not have time to take to the skies to meet German bombers in the air before they attacked. An RAF exercise in August 1934 found that, under certain circumstances, Britain's air defences were vulnerable to raids by a paltry enemy force of as little as 5 bombers. As a result, Dowding was appointed to a subcommittee of the Committee of Imperial Defence focusing on air defence. One of his initial recommendations was the replacement of outdated wooden biplanes with new monoplanes with metal airframes. After attending many trials of aircraft and weaponry, Dowding concluded that British military aircraft were lagging behind their continental European powers and proposed that the Air Council should open up a new position focusing solely on research and development. In January 1935, Dowding was himself appointed to the position and gave up his responsibilities for supply and organisation. Dowding encouraged the production of fighter aircraft, armed with 8 machine guns mounted on the wings, capable of firing 1,000 rounds a minute. He was consequently instrumental in the development of the Hawker Hurricane, which first entered service in December 1937, and would become the most effective British fighter plane of the Second World War, while the Supermarine Spitfire followed in August 1938. While the former was cheaper to build and easier to repair, the latter was technically superior but had a shorter range. By the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, 18 squadrons were equipped with Hurricanes and 9 with Spitfires. In order to increase wartime production capacity, Dowding signed procurement agreements with car manufacturers to produce parts for military aircraft. A rearmament plan adopted in 1935 envisaged an expansion of air defence to 70 bomber and 35 fighter squadrons, and in July 1936, Air Defence of Great Britain was split up into Bomber Command under Sir John Steele and Fighter Command under Dowding, a testament to the belief that Dowding knew more than any other figure in Britain about fighter planes and their use in war. Dowding and fellow RAF officers recognised that effective air defence required an early warning system to enable fighters to respond to enemy bomber missions before their planes reached English airspace. In January 1935, Robert Watson Watt of the National Physical Laboratory had produced a report suggesting that it would be possible to detect and locate aircraft via electromagnetic radiation waves. After holding a trial in February which demonstrated that a plane could be detected at an 8-mile range, Dowding agreed to provide funding for further research for radar, an abbreviation for radio detection and ranging. After taking over Fighter Command in 1936, Dowding and RAF scientist Henry Tizard ensured that radar technology was integrated into the air defense system, enabling Fighter Command's planes to take up positions to confront incoming aircraft. The innovation revolutionized fighter tactics, eliminating the need for constant air patrols. By April 1939, there were 11 working radar stations providing coverage along almost the full length of the east coast of Britain. Dowding's headquarters as head of Fighter Command were at Bentley Priory, an 18th-century country house near Stanmore to the northwest of London. On New Year's Day 1937, Dowding was promoted to Air Chief Marshal, equivalent to full general. In February 1937, he was disappointed to learn that he had been overlooked for promotion to Chief of the Air Staff, the highest position in the RAF. But his spirits were lifted in June when he was awarded the Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order by King George VI during the Hendon Air Show. Armed with his extensive experience studying air defense, Dowding set to building communication systems to ensure that he could receive information from radar stations and observation posts. Operation rooms were installed at Bentley Priory and airfields around the country, with the positions of friendly and hostile aircraft plotted on maps based on the latest data from the radar stations and observer corps. While Dowding recognized that he had to delegate tactical control to his subordinates, he would retain full control over the radar system, and Bentley Priory served as a hub to filter information from radar and observers to his sector commanders. As late as 1937, the RAF and Luftwaffe were still exchanging visits of air officers, and when the Luftwaffe's second-in-command, Erhard Milch, visited Bentley Priory in October, he interrupted the formalities by asking Dowding about the progress he was making with his radio detection system. While Dowding retained his customary composure, several of his fellow officers showed signs of discomfort. Milch then informed Dowding that the Luftwaffe was developing its own radar system and was confident that the Germans would win the race. Although Milch would be mistaken, there were still several problems Dowding had to solve before radar could be used by his fighters. It was only in March 1939 when scientists came up with an identification device to distinguish friendly aircraft from enemy aircraft, and by October 1940, virtually every RAF plane was fitted with it. In early 1937, Dowding developed a comprehensive plan for air defense, one which required 45 fighter squadrons, 1,200 heavy anti-aircraft guns, and up to 5,000 searchlights. Dowding argued that while offensive capabilities were required to win a war, an effective air defense was essential to ensure Britain could survive enemy attack and had the time to prepare for offensive action. The RAF's preference towards bombers was partly encouraged by a desire to convince the government that air power alone could win a war, as it competed with the Army and Navy for defense funding. In mid-1937, the Air Ministry determined that more than 1,400 bombers were required to confront the Luftwaffe, but only around 500 fighters. But by late 1937, Sir Thomas Inskip, the Minister for Coordination of Defence, convinced the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, that defence ought to be prioritised over offence. Acknowledging that Britain's aircraft production could not catch up with Germany's in the short to medium term, and that fighters were cheaper to produce than bombers. Despite a series of increasingly ambitious rearmament plans from the mid-1930s, even after the Hurricane and Spitfire entered service in 1938, the fighter planes at Dowding's disposal were still predominantly biplanes, and it was not until 1939 that Hurricanes and Spitfires were produced in large numbers. Dowding's efforts were further undermined by disagreements about tactics. he believed that it was most effective for fighter planes to chase down enemy bombers and attack them from behind. But several of his colleagues, including Sholto Douglas, Assistant Chief of the Air Staff, favoured two-seater fighters such as the Bolton Paul Defiant, which had a 4-gun turret at the rear and nothing firing forwards, forcing the pilot to fly in front of the enemy to enable his gunner to open fire at the enemy, with both men unable to coordinate or help each other in the heat of battle. In June 1938, Dowding was dismayed when Douglas ordered him to equip 9 of his 38 squadrons with Defiants. When war came in September 1939, Dowding would do all he could to restrict the use of Defiants to training purposes. He also launched an initiative at this time to have the cockpits of fighter planes equipped with bulletproof windscreens. When he was met with incredulous laughter, he asked, "If Chicago gangsters can have bulletproof windows for their cars, why can't my pilots have bulletproof windscreens?" Subsequent testing proved that the added weight of the bulletproof glass was not a problem, and they would reduce casualties significantly. Dowding also had to convince the Air Ministry that his planes required all-weather hard runways. When Air Ministry officials suggested that paved runways were difficult to camouflage and would make obvious targets for enemy bombing raids, Dowding informed them that it was more important for his pilots to take off and land quickly and safely, and that any efforts to disguise landing strips would likely confuse British pilots as much as the enemy. Although Dowding would eventually win this argument, construction work progressed so slowly that only one airfield had all-weather runways by the time war broke out in September 1939. In October 1938, Neville Chamberlain met Hitler in Munich with the French and Italian leaders Édouard Daladier and Benito Mussolini. There they agreed to the German annexation of the German-speaking Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia along the German border, in return for a promise from the Nazis to stop further territorial expansion. While Chamberlain's claim to have brought peace in our time would prove hopelessly naive, at the time Britain was in no position to go to war. Although the British government had prioritized the RAF over the Navy and Army, most of Fighter Command's 500-odd planes were obsolete, while Bomber Command had few aircraft that could reach Germany. For several years, Dowding had been skeptical of the Air Ministry's assumptions about the impact of bombing raids. In July 1938, he organized a test, in which he dispersed 30 obsolete biplanes on Salisbury Plain as targets for bombers. After a week's worth of bombing, 26 of the planes were still in airworthy condition. While results gave Dowding confidence that his fighters were not as vulnerable to enemy bombing as RAF doctrine suggested, he continued to strengthen Fighter Command's capabilities until he was due to relinquish his post in July 1939. In the event, Dowding's term was extended when his designated replacement, Sir Christopher Courtney, was injured in an accident. Then the Second World War broke out in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France responded by declaring war on the Nazi regime. Britain could do nothing to prevent the swift conquest of Poland, but minor Luftwaffe raids over the English Channel were taking place in the 8 months from September 1939 to May 1940. This gave Dowding valuable time to improve his air defense system both on the ground and in the air. In May 1940, Germany finally invaded the Low Countries and France. It was a disaster from an aerial perspective. Almost immediately, the Luftwaffe destroyed much of the French Air Force on the ground, while German tanks rolling through the Low Countries into northern France ensured that the French armies on the eastern border could not respond in time. On the 16th of May, Dowding wrote an influential letter to the Air Ministry, stating that he only had 36 of the 52 squadrons he needed to effectively defend the skies over Britain, and he could not spare any more to support operations in France. While Winston Churchill, who had been made British Prime Minister in early May 1940 after years of warning about German intentions, agreed not to send any further fighter squadrons to France. The RAF was obliged to operate from British bases to support the evacuation of Allied troops from Dunkirk at the end of May. Dowding entrusted tactical command to Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, a New Zealander who had been his deputy at Fighter Command until April 1940. As commander of No. 11 Group covering southeast England, Park was given 16 squadrons to provide air cover. By the time the evacuation was over on the 4th of June, 340,000 Allied troops were rescued. Fighter Command had lost over 400 Spitfires and Hurricanes in France, though the RAF played an often underappreciated role in the evacuation from Dunkirk. Had it not been for the aerial cover they provided, the Luftwaffe would have sent many more ships to the bottom of the English Channel. By July 1940, with the French completely defeated, German eyes turned to knocking Britain out of the war. Hitler hoped to defeat Britain without invading the island, instead using a combination of naval and air power to force the British to surrender through strangling their shipping lanes and bombing their cities intensely. By the time the Luftwaffe began its first major attacks on London in early July 1940, Dowding was scheduled to relinquish his leadership of Fighter Command within days. Although Churchill had high regard for Dowding and believed that he should not be replaced during the war, it was not until August 1940 that Air Minister Archibald Sinclair informed Dowding that he would remain in his post. Despite Dowding's extensive preparations, the RAF appeared to be the underdog against the Luftwaffe when the Battle of Britain began on the 10th of July 1940. Compared to the often farcical RAF training exercises, Luftwaffe pilots gained fighting experience supporting General Francisco Franco's nationalists in the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939, and had been devastatingly effective in the campaign against France. While Dowding had drawn up his plans based on assumptions that the Luftwaffe would have to operate from bases in Germany, the rapid fall of France enabled the German Air Force to attack Britain from much closer range on the other side of the English Channel. However, Dowding did enjoy some other key advantages over his enemy. While the Luftwaffe initially enjoyed a numerical advantage, by 1940 British factories were producing almost 500 fighters a month, compared to fewer than 200 in Germany, where there was a growing focus on bomber planes. The increase in British aircraft production owed much to Lord Beaverbrook, the newspaper magnate whom Churchill had appointed Minister of Aircraft Production and who was one of Dowding's champions within the government. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe lacked a heavy strategic bomber that could inflict the scale of destruction Hitler demanded, and its fighter planes, primarily the Messerschmitt Bf 109, were less maneuverable than the Hurricane and Spitfire. That the British had these technical advantages by 1940 was owing to the innovations Dowding had introduced during the 1930s. Although Dowding was concerned about the losses incurred in France, the RAF had performed admirably, and during the 6-week campaign, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,200 aircraft. Nevertheless, Dowding was relieved that the Luftwaffe did not attack Britain in force until July. The Luftwaffe had over 1,300 bombers and 1,000 fighters available by that time, including around 750 Messerschmitt Bf 109s, while Dowding had 450 Hurricanes and 300 Spitfires at his disposal. In Dowding's assessment, he had to prevent the Luftwaffe from gaining air superiority for the next 3 or 4 months, until the onset of poor weather in the winter across the English Channel would hamper German aerial plans. Then, by the late spring and summer of 1941, Britain's air defence would be significantly strengthened, and there was hope that the United States would join Britain in the war. Dowding delegated tactical control to 4 group commanders. Keith Park's No. 11 Group in the southeast was given 23 squadrons. Sir Quintin Brand's No. 10 Group covered the southwest with 10 squadrons. Trafford Leigh-Mallory's No. 12 Group's 14 squadrons were responsible for East Anglia and the Midlands, while Richard Sewell's 13 Group had his 14 squadrons spread out in an arc from Northern Ireland via Scotland to Newcastle. Although the name had been coined by Churchill in a parliamentary speech on the 18th of June, the Battle of Britain was more of a campaign with several distinct phases. Between the 10th of July and the 11th of August 1940, the Luftwaffe's main targets were shipping and naval bases in the English Channel and along the south coast of England. These targets were very close to France, and radar stations could not detect enemy aircraft in time before they struck them. Thus, Dowding was compelled to maintain standing patrols in the air during this initial phase of the Battle of Britain. This left veteran pilots exhausted and prone to making mistakes. But Dowding was reluctant to replace experienced fighters with freshly trained recruits. In order to preserve his limited resources, Dowding believed a single squadron of 12 fighters was sufficient to meet each enemy wave. Over the course of the month, the RAF lost 178 aircraft, including over 100 fighters from enemy action, as well as a significant number due to accidents, especially when attempting to fly at night. Nevertheless, the Luftwaffe lost more than 300 planes, giving the RAF a near 2-to-1 ratio in terms of casualties inflicted. Although he was inflicting greater damage to the enemy and the pace of British aircraft production was gradually reducing German numerical superiority, Dowding mourned the loss of hundreds of experienced pilots. While he was happy to draw on a small supply of French, Dutch and Belgian pilots from the foreign resistance movements that had been formed in London, he was more reluctant to integrate Polish and Czech pilots within the RAF, and a separate Polish Air Force was established in Britain instead. Nevertheless, by September, Dowding was convinced that the Poles and the Czechs were among the bravest and most talented of his pilots. At a dinner with Churchill, when the Prime Minister expressed his view that one Pole was worth 3 Frenchmen, Dowding suggested that 10-to-1 was more accurate. On the 12th of August, after being ordered to quickly achieve air superiority over the RAF, Goering's Luftwaffe began to target RAF airfields in England. Dowding hoped that his planes would be able to take to the air to meet the enemy before they reached their targets, though the air bases in Kent, closest to France, struggled to respond in time to radar warnings. Fighter Command maintained its record of downing 2 enemy aircraft for the loss of every one. Success in the southeast prompted Goering to send a fleet of bombers from Scandinavia in a diversionary attack on northern England on the 15th of August. No. 13 Group responded effectively to the threat, and the German bombers were beaten back with heavy losses. The following day, Churchill visited one of the RAF headquarters at Uxbridge, while No. 11 Group was responding to several waves of Luftwaffe attacks. As he was leaving, Churchill remarked that, "Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few," a line that he repeated in Parliament 4 days later. On the 24th of August, the Luftwaffe changed its tactics by employing a larger number of smaller formations, with bombers protected by close escorts. By early September, the Fighter Command had downed almost 750 enemy aircraft and lost close to 500 fighters, and Dowding continued to struggle to replace fallen pilots. On the 7th of September 1940, Dowding expressed his concerns about replacing pilots to Sholto Douglas, who was carrying out many of the duties of Chief of the Air Staff, but the latter failed to appreciate Dowding's insistence that men were not only trained to fly but also to fight. During the meeting, the Luftwaffe launched a massive raid on London, with 348 bombers escorted by 617 fighters. This initiated a new stage of the Battle of Britain. As the Luftwaffe abandoned its focus on reducing RAF assets and began to target the City of London, hoping to demoralize the British population and force its surrender. Between the 7th of September and the 12th of November, the Luftwaffe launched almost 60 major night bombing raids against the British capital. Dowding's system was not equipped for night fighting, and the RAF would not produce an effective night fighter plane until the introduction of the Bristol Beaufighter in March 1941. Dowding's radar stations all faced towards the coast, and the observer corps was no use at spotting enemy planes at night, forcing Dowding to hastily set up radar stations further inland. The RAF was under political pressure to do something in response to the raids on London, and Douglas proposed assigning more Hurricanes for night fighting, overruling Dowding's objections that they were useless without airborne radar systems, which were not yet available. London suffered terribly during the Blitz, though it would have been immensely worse had it not been for the preventative measures taken by the RAF. Fighter Command's greatest success came on the 15th of September, when the Luftwaffe sustained 175 casualties to 12 killed and a further 12 wounded. Around this time, Hitler acknowledged that Operation Sea Lion, his planned amphibious invasion of England, had to be postponed as the aerial and naval campaigns had not been successful enough. Despite Dowding's success in resisting wave after wave of attack from the Luftwaffe, his leadership of Fighter Command came under criticism from several subordinates. Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commander of 12 Group, was unhappy that he had been relegated to a supporting role to Park's No. 11 Group. In his attempt to secure a more active role, Leigh-Mallory supported Douglas Bader's big wing theory. A brilliant pilot, Bader had returned to the cockpit after losing both his legs in an accident in 1931. Using sheer upper body strength to use his prosthetic legs to push a custom-fitted set of pedals. By September 1940, he was leading one of No. 12 Group's squadrons based at Duxford in Cambridgeshire. Keen for more action himself, Bader proposed a large formation of 3 squadrons from No. 12 Group to take off immediately upon receiving news that the enemy was organizing a raid to intercept the enemy at high altitude. Without any supporting evidence, Bader claimed to Leigh-Mallory that he had used these tactics to repulse 100 enemy aircraft with only 10 Hurricanes. On the 17th of September, Leigh-Mallory reported to Dowding on further successes of big wing formations. While Park was prepared to allow squadrons from No. 12 Group to relieve exhausted squadrons of his No. 11 Group, Air Ministry officials endorsed big wing instead. Despite Bader's claims, the larger wings took longer to form, and on several occasions the British fighters were not in place to face German attacks. In October, Dowding attended a conference to discuss fighter tactics, where he and Park were opposed by Leigh-Mallory and Bader. Sholto Douglas appeared determined to brush aside Dowding's objections and ruled in favour of big wing. On the 13th of October 1940, Hitler announced that Operation Sea Lion would be postponed until the following spring, but it was not until December that the plans were scrapped entirely. Meanwhile, the night bombing raids continued with great intensity. Thanks to Dowding's efforts in creating an integrated air defense system, bringing together radar, the observer corps, radio communications, operations rooms, anti-aircraft guns, and Hurricanes and Spitfires, Fighter Command ensured Britain's survival in the Second World War, and Dowding had broken the Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility. While Fighter Command's successful defense of Britain from Nazi invasion in the summer and autumn of 1940 ranks alongside the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 and Horatio Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in 1805 in the annals of British military glory, its chief architect was soon demoted. Dowding's positions on night fighting and his opposition to big wing put him at odds with what squadron leader Peter Brown called a cabal of politicians and senior officers at Air Ministry, which included Sholto Douglas and 2 retired chiefs of the Air Staff, Hugh Trenchard and Sir John Salmond. Although Dowding continued to work hard at the problem of night defense, his reluctance to support any proactive operations until an effective night fighter was available encouraged his detractors to move against him. On the 13th of November, Archibald Sinclair informed Dowding that he was to lead a mission to the United States to purchase new aircraft and equipment. Dowding was reluctant to leave Fighter Command, but he accepted the new posting after meeting Churchill the following day. He left Fighter Command a week and a half later and was succeeded by Sholto Douglas, while Keith Park was dismissed as commander of No. 11 Group and replaced by his rival Leigh-Mallory. While Dowding's removal from his post at Fighter Command has become the subject of historical controversy, there were strong arguments for Dowding to step aside. He was 58 years old and was clearly exhausted by the heavy burden he had borne through the battles of France and Britain. While the strategic approach to the war was changing as the immediate threat of a German invasion diminished, a notorious raid on Coventry on the 14th of November had also claimed the lives of 1,800 civilians convincing Churchill that a change at the top of Fighter Command was needed. Yet, as Dowding had anticipated, the new leadership was also unable to respond effectively to night raids. On the night of the 10th of May 1941 and into the early hours of the 11th, over 500 German bombers attacked London in one of the largest aerial bombardments of the whole war, one which was doubtlessly timed by the Germans to mark the one-year anniversary of Churchill's appointment as Prime Minister. This led to over 3,000 civilian casualties. It was, though, the last major raid on England by the Luftwaffe, which was diverted eastwards thereafter to support Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Dowding crossed the Atlantic by sea in late December 1940 and met with Canadian and American dignitaries in January 1941. Although he was not a natural diplomat, Dowding made a good impression and made sure to praise the American aircraft in service with the RAF. He was impressed by American navigational equipment and secured an order for airborne radar. While spending much of his time touring airfields and factories and giving lectures about fighter combat and the war in general, while Dowding's general impressions of American aircraft production were positive, he reported to Beaverbrook that the American Air Force lacked fighting experience and the planes were lacking in armor. Dowding's time in North America proved short-lived, as he fell out with the new British ambassador in Washington, Lord Halifax, Chamberlain's controversial foreign secretary who had suggested exploring peace initiatives while serving in Churchill's war cabinet. While Halifax encouraged Americans to subscribe to the RAF Benevolent Fund, Dowding objected to this and believed it was humiliating to be asking for American donations. Halifax believed that Dowding's straight-talking was undermining British foreign policy and asked Churchill to recall Dowding. While Churchill and Beaverbrook initially hoped that Dowding would remain in America, Dowding himself wanted to return to Britain. In April, Dowding was working on plans to transport American airmen to Britain and decided to test things out by making the journey home in a converted bomb bay in early May. Despite faults with the oxygen supply and the heating, Dowding survived to tell the tale. Over the next few months, Churchill offered Dowding various posts, including that of Governor of Southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, but Dowding either refused or was opposed by the Air Ministry. When a pamphlet about the Battle of Britain was published by the Air Ministry in 1941, neither Dowding nor Park were mentioned by name, an omission that required the intervention of Churchill in order for it to be corrected. Dowding worked on his own account of the Battle of Britain, a book which he entitled 12 Legions of Angels, but the book was not published until 1946 due to fears that the information within it would be useful to the Germans. Dowding was retired from the RAF on the 1st of October 1941, but at the end of the month was asked by Churchill to consider whether it was possible to cut RAF personnel who might be more effectively employed in other war work now that the Battle of Britain was largely over. His recommendations led to almost 25,000 individuals being freed up and further alienated him from the Air Ministry and RAF. By June 1942, Dowding had no desire to remain in his post and retired permanently in July 1942, after over 40 years of military service. King George VI proposed promoting Dowding to the rank of Marshal of the Royal Air Force, but the unprecedented royal recommendation was rejected by the Air Ministry. Following his retirement, Dowding began to write opinion articles on aviation matters in national newspapers, and continued to fear the prospect of the Luftwaffe launching another attack on Britain with more advanced aircraft at a time when the Hurricane was already obsolete. In April 1943, Dowding gave up a ceremonial role he had been given as King George's principal aide-de-camp. The following month, he accepted an offer of a noble title from Churchill, becoming Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory. For the remainder of his life, Dowding took an increasing interest in spiritualism and would write 4 books on the subject between 1943 and 1951. He claimed that he was in constant communication with his late wife Clarice and that he had received messages from airmen killed during the Battle of Britain. Dowding acknowledged that his views were unorthodox, but hoped that they would bring comfort to bereaved families. Dowding's beliefs led him to meet Muriel Whiting, the widow of an RAF flight engineer killed in action in 1944. Despite a significant age difference, the couple shared many interests and were married on the 25th of September 1951. Under Muriel's influence, Dowding gave up hunting, became a vegetarian, and spoke about the humane treatment of animals in the House of Lords. In March 1958, Dowding was named Life President of the Battle of Britain Fighter Association. He made regular appearances at the memorial service at Westminster Abbey, marking Battle of Britain Day, observed on the 15th of September every year to mark one of the days in the autumn of 1940 when Dowding's fighter units had inflicted particularly heavy casualties on the Luftwaffe in the skies over England. However, his health was in decline, and in 1961 he broke his hip while skiing. He suffered from arthritis and gradually lost his eyesight, making his last public appearance at the London premiere of the 1969 film Battle of Britain, starring Laurence Olivier as Dowding, where he received a standing ovation from the audience members, including many former RAF airmen. On the 15th of February 1970, 2 months shy of his 88th birthday, Hugh Dowding died at his home in Tunbridge Wells in Kent. He was cremated on the 12th of March. His ashes were placed in the RAF chapel in Westminster Abbey. Despite their previous differences, Douglas Bader wrote an obituary in The Guardian, declaring that Dowding surely earned his place alongside Nelson and Wellington and other great military names in our history. In October 1988, Dowding was further honoured with the unveiling of a statue in his honour in front of St Clement Danes on the Strand in London, which since 1958 has served as the RAF's central church. It was a fitting tribute to the man who, despite his limited abilities as a pilot, had played a crucial role in building an integrated air defence system to defend Britain from invasion in 1940. Not only had Dowding played a pivotal part in the invention of radar and the production of the Hurricanes and Spitfires, he had convinced the British government to prioritise air defence over offensive operations. Contrary to received RAF wisdom, he had resisted political pressure to sacrifice his fighters for little reward during the Battle of France, and during the Battle of Britain he ensured that the country was protected from all directions, while having full confidence in Keith Park's ability to respond to each successive wave of enemy attack over the English Channel. While Dowding was unable to protect London from night raids, his successors did not fare much better. Were it not for Dowding's outspokenness and his willingness to challenge RAF doctrine, he may not have had the resources he needed to defeat the Luftwaffe. But it made him too many enemies within the RAF and contributed to his demotion. Despite the personal favour of Churchill and King George, he was not accorded the recognition his supporters felt he deserved until after his death. Today, he is rightly regarded as one of the great British heroes of the Second World War. What do you think of Hugh Dowding? Was he the man who made the greatest contribution to Britain's survival from German invasion in 1940? Should he have received greater recognition and honours during his lifetime, or was the Air Ministry justified in removing him from Fighter Command? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you for watching People Profiles Documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.